If you've been trying to figure out the difference between an IEP and a 504, watch this video. Hello everyone and welcome to the channel where we endeavor to educate, equip, and encourage anybody raising a child with a special healthcare need. In this video, I'm talking about one of the most common questions that I get in the clinical work that I do. Does my child need an IEP? What is an IEP? What's the difference between an IEP and a 504? If these are questions you're asking, keep watching. If you have any comments or other ideas on things you'd like to see in these videos, please put the comments below. I do read those. Let's start with an IEP. An IEP stands for an Individualized Education Plan, and it outlines the specific measurable goals for your child as they participate in special education services. The goals that are outlined are SMART goals, specific, measurable, and the A, and R's and some T's, but they're SMART goals. So my point is, they're goals that are not arbitrary. They're measurable, they're held to a standard, and they will be reassessed continually. A 504 is similar to an IEP, but it's much less formal. The documentation itself is much shorter. The goals are less measurable, but they're more applicable to different scenarios and to different disabilities or developmental struggles. In preparation of this video, I've looked at many different websites and have 20 years of clinical experience. And the outline that I'm using for this content can be found in a very well summarized document on the website ADD Attitude, and I'm going to put a link in the description below. They do a great job of summarizing this information. Now let's talk about the origin stories of the IEP and the 504. The IEP comes from federal legislation that stems from the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, or the IDEA. It's federally mandated programs that receives federal funds to provide services for children who qualify for the services within the public school system. The 504 comes from Section 504 in the 1973 Rehabilitation Act, which is also federal legislation that prohibits the discrimination of individuals with disabilities in the public school system. Both the IEP and the 504 ensure a free and public education, or better known as FAPE. Now let's talk about who exactly qualifies for these two types of interventions. Let's start with the IEP. Autism, blindness, deafness, emotional disturbance, hearing impairments, multiple disabilities, orthopedic disabilities, other health impairments, which could also include right there ADHD, specific learning disabilities, speech and language impairments, traumatic brain injury, and visual impairments. Now that's a long list. And what I want you to understand is you may find your child on that list somewhere, but just because they're on the list doesn't necessarily mean that they require IEP levels of supports. This is a beginner list, but within that list, there are other considerations which we'll talk about next. Now, who qualifies for a 504 is a little bit different. The 504 criteria are not nearly as specific. They're more broad and basically pertain to any child who has a documented disability that impairs their ability to be successful in a public school setting. So how do you begin the process of an evaluation? Well, it starts with making a formal request to the school. But you have to understand that if the schools can demonstrate progress or remediation of the primary difficulty with interventions that they put in place, then they're not obligated to proceed if they can demonstrate benefit. But if benefit cannot be demonstrated with those types of interventions, the school is obligated to conduct a formal assessment. Now, please understand that you can request an independent assessment outside of the school. Some schools may pay for that, some schools may not. If you go and get an independent evaluation, you have to understand that under IEP supports, the school is obligated to at least acknowledge those recommendations and diagnoses and determine if there's some way that they can operationalize them within an IEP, but they're not bound to follow whatever information you bring to them from the community, no matter how expensive it was or how impressive the facility that you visited. Under IEP guidelines, they are obligated to acknowledge that it's been done, to look at this and determine if it's reasonable for the school system. But under 504 legislation, the school is not bound to acknowledge or comply with outside information. If you go out and spend a bunch of money on these assessments, you have to have a realistic expectation about what you hope to gain. Sometimes these can be really beneficial and the information can be very useful to the school in dictating how they're approaching things. Other times, it only confirms things that were already known and that the interventions were already going to be put in place, irregardless of how much money that you spend in the middle. Okay, so now let's talk about who actually puts these plans together. Let's start with an IEP. When you're formulating an IEP, it's very important that there's not a lot of wiggle room here in terms of who needs to be in the room and putting this plan together. First and foremost, it's a parent or guardian, okay? So if an IEP gets put in place, as I've said before, this is a formalized document with measurable goals. Think of it like a contract. This is like a marriage between the family and the school, whereas a 504 is a little bit like speed dating. Okay, you're in, you're out, you do things. Those are very useful, but I think it's important that you understand the difference. When you're putting together an IEP, you have the parent or guardian, you have the general education teacher, and you have the special education teacher. Now there may be other folks that contribute, so physical therapists, occupational speech therapy supports, there's all kinds of other input, but those are the folks that need to be available. Now when you're considering a 504, what you have to understand is the people who put that together can vary a little bit more broadly because again, this is a less binding document. This is less of a marriage and more of speed dating. So of course you have parents or guardians, you can have teachers, the principal, sometimes the special education teacher. You can have many different voices, but the thing you have to understand is it's not as formalized and it really is best put together by the people who know the child best. Okay, now let's talk about what these plans look like, okay? What actually comes out of the printer at the end of the thing. Let's start first with IEPs. Now what you have to understand is that IEPs read like stereo instructions, okay? That's the best I can do. I've seen several of these come across my desk. They always hurt my eyes. They're super long and there's a bunch of words and some graphs. And I'm not diminishing the value of these documents, but you have to understand they are overwhelming because they have several components. As I've said before, it's very formal. So everything is written down and mutually agreed upon. Let me be more specific. The IEP is going to start with the academic and behavioral status. And then it's going to go through the academic and behavioral goals that reflect that status, kind of outlining what it is that we're shooting for. Once you've outlined the goals, they put together strategies to implement those goals and who will be doing the implementation. Next up, they're going to talk about accommodations, services, and curriculum changes. What kind of specific changes are we going to make to the environment in terms of seating, in terms of classroom location, in terms of where we do our learning, who's going to change the curriculum, what kind of curriculum changes are we going to implement in order to achieve our goals, things of that nature. Next, they're going to talk about timing. Okay, so again, this is pretty specific. They're going to talk about timing. When do we expect these things to happen? What time of day? When do we expect to see progress? When are we going to re-implement these things? We're going to re-evaluate these things. Timing. And lastly, they're going to put together a plan for standardized testing. Are there going to be special accommodations? Where is it going to occur? When do we expect it to happen? What kind of standardized testing are we talking about? And then at the very end of the IEP, we're always going to be looking forward with transition services. Transition into the next school year, transition to high school, transition into life beyond high school. It's important that you also understand that an IEP can serve an individual up through 21 years of age. Now let's talk about 504 plans. Look, as I've said, 504 plans are less formal. So sometimes they're not even written down, but honestly, they're almost always written down. And they're going to include some similar criteria, such as what specific accommodations are we talking about, who is going to be responsible for determining if those are effective accommodations, and then who is responsible for implementing these changes to the classroom setting. It's kind of those three broad categories. And again, it can involve lots of people. A 504 is not going to be as formal, nor is it going to be nearly as measurable, but it's going to have some similarities to an IEP, but on a much smaller scale. Again, remember, marriage versus speed dating. End of our video, let's talk about parental involvement. Okay, so both an IEP and a 504 are certainly going to mandate the presence or consent from a parent or guardian. Schools can't do evaluations on a child in the context of an IEP or a 504 without the knowledge and consent of the parents or the guardians. Now, understand that in an IEP evaluation, we're talking about the presence of a parent or guardian at those meetings, hammering out the details, figuring it out. IEP meetings are big. There's usually lots of different players there, which we discussed earlier, but they at least have the individuals that we discussed, so a general education teacher, a special education teacher, and the parents making the decisions and helping contributing to the final product. Whereas a 504 certainly mandates that a parent or guardian consent to the assessment, but it can actually occur and things can be implemented without the presence of a parent at all steps of the journey. Now, my experience with 504s is that parents are there, that these revisions of a 504 plan or the review of a 504 plan happens yearly, sometimes with the vice principal, sometimes with the principal, sometimes with the special education teacher. So I don't mean to say that parents aren't involved. Of course they are. But I want you to understand that their role in the 504 process can be a little bit more distant. Certainly input is needed, but not nearly as formal as an IEP. Now let's talk about revisions, right? Let's say you had a meeting, you made some goals, things went well. We have to understand it's both an IEP and a 504 in general are going to be reevaluated every year. An IEP is most certainly going to be reevaluated every year, but sometimes with 504s, the rules vary by state. But as a general rule, you're going to reassess both of these interventions on a yearly basis. And that's your opportunity to bring up your questions and your concerns. But also understand that every 3 years at least, both a 504 and an IEP is going to be reevaluated, not because we're trying to make changes, because we're trying to decide if this is still necessary. Now listen, when people tell me that their child is being reevaluated for an IEP and whether or not it's necessary, I like to remind them, I say, listen, this is actually a compliment. Okay, your child's made great progress. School has done fantastic. And this child has responded well, and they're pulling back some of the services because they think that this child can be successful in a least restrictive environment, even more so than the year prior. So the discussion about removing IEPs and 504s, please don't take that as an insult. It's actually a compliment, but it's going to occur every 3 years at least because we don't want children to receive services that they don't require. Now let's talk about my least favorite part of all this, disputes. Look, most of you watching this video are pleased with your supports through the school, and please understand that I'm a huge public school fan. Like, I love them, okay? They're doing the best they can, teachers are doing the best they can. I'm huge, I love it. Okay, but sometimes there's not a good fit, the communication stream's not there, and the IEP you don't feel like is being followed appropriately, and it's time to see if we can make some changes, and you've not had a lot of success, and it's time to resolve a dispute. Let's talk about how that works. Disputes with these services can best be handled first and foremost by informal negotiation. The good old go in there with an attaché case and a Starbucks mug and just have a little convo. Say about what you appreciate, about how everybody's trying to do, make sure everyone feels acknowledged and respected, and then talk about your grievance, and then talk about ways that you could potentially see this grievance being resolved. Please understand that schools can only do so much. I know your child would do better when they're studying their math if they rode on a pony. I have no doubt that ponies would be a developmental enhancer for a lot of kids. Schools don't do ponies. It's not really a pony thing. Petting zoos is not really a part of the federal funds that come into schools for IEP support. So when you go into these meetings, be reasonable. These people are working hard, so just please receive that with love, okay? Next up, we have mediation, right? Where you've got kind of a go-between, where you got maybe a lawyer and somebody working between you and the schools. They're going back and forth trying to find a middle ground and moving forward. Step 3 is a due process hearing. Step 4 is an appeals or civil rights lawsuit. And step 5 is a formal state or federal complaint. My sincere hope is that of all the things that we just discussed, you never have to experience most of them. My experience with schools is that they are increasingly helpful. They want to help your child be successful. They may have a little different perspective on how that works, but it doesn't mean it's bad or wrong. They may see your child's strengths and weaknesses a little bit different. So do your best to try and come to an informal agreement. And lastly, let's talk about funding. How do these things get paid for? Well, please understand that IEPs have federal dollars attached to them that come into the school system to help support those needs, and that makes perfect sense. If you've got a kid, if you've got a school district that has a high population of individuals who need IEP levels of support, they're going to be stretched really thin unless they can get some federal dollars to meet those needs as best they can. And so please understand that there are federal dollars attached to IEP supports, which again makes sense because these are formal interventions, they're measurable interventions, and the schools really need to be set up to be successful by receiving federal dollars to implement the necessary interventions. 504s, on the other hand, don't receive federal dollars. 504 plans are done really just out of the margins of what school has available. So if your child has a 504 and the school's doing a number of things to try and meet the needs of your child through a 504, please understand that they're giving out of the margins and they're not receiving federal dollars to do this. That being said, while they don't receive federal dollars to provide 504 supports, they certainly lose money if they don't follow or acknowledge 504 plans, and certainly nobody wants that. Also understand that IEP dollars cannot be shifted to 504 dollars and used to fund 504 programs. That is not possible. IEPs are attached to federal funds to provide services within the school. 504 plans do not receive federal funding and exist in the margins. So if your child has a 504 plan, please be gracious with the school and knowing that they're doing the best they have and giving what they can without receiving any additional income to support those interventions in the school. I sincerely hope this is helpful. I want to thank all the folks at ADD Attitude for putting together this very concise list, which again, I'm going to put the link in the description because I do think they have some nice services as it relates to IEPs and 504s. Please check out our other videos. Thank you for watching.